The boardroom stretched like a stage built for power. Glass walls framed the New York skyline in sharp light, each skyscraper glowing like a judge waiting to pass its verdict. Inside the room, silence pressed heavy against the long mahogany table, a silence broken only by the sound of Richard Sterling's shallow breathing. He was a billionaire by numbers, by empire, by reputation. But in this moment, none of it mattered. The man who had never stumbled was trembling before his own audience. Investors sat in crisp rows, their faces sculpted from granite. Some leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Others reclined with folded arms, but all radiated the same energy: disappointment. Richard's hand shook as he adjusted his tie, though it was already perfectly aligned. His silver hair caught the fluorescent lights, but even its polished shine could not mask the sweat at his temple. At the far end of the table, Alexander Crowe smirked. His rival. Dressed in a sharp black suit that seemed to drink the light, Crowe looked like the shadow of everything Richard feared. Crowe didn't need to speak. His smirk did all the damage. Richard's voice cracked as he tried to explain. The numbers will recover. This setback is temporary. Our projections... His words died mid-air, heavy with emptiness. Charts flickered on the screen behind him, red lines plummeting like falling knives. The investors shifted, restless. A woman in emerald silk, Victoria Hayes, leaned forward. Her words cut sharper than glass. "Mr. Sterling, you promised growth. You promised stability. What we see are losses. How do you explain failing at the very deal you guaranteed would secure us millions?" The room tightened. All eyes locked on him. Richard's throat dried as he reached for the glass of water at his side. The glass rattled against the table. He hated the sound. It revealed too much. In the corner of the room, unnoticed by nearly all, stood Evelyn. She wore the plain uniform of the cleaning staff, her hands clasped around the handle of a mop bucket. She was invisible, or so they thought. A ghost in the grand theater of wealth. But Evelyn's eyes were alive. She had seen the cracks forming long before this day, had heard conversations whispered in corridors, had caught numbers scribbled carelessly on discarded papers. While she cleaned, she listened. While she dusted, she understood. Now, she stood. Still, her dark skin glowing softly under the artificial lights, her posture calm even as the storm raged across the table. Richard's mind scrambled. He looked down at the contracts spread before him. Lines, figures, promises. And yet, each sheet mocked him. He had built towers of steel and glass across the world, but in this room, he could not build a single bridge of trust. One investor, an older man with piercing blue eyes, slammed his palm on the table. "This is unacceptable. Do you realize the scale of what you've lost? Millions! Sterling Enterprises was supposed to be unshakable, and now look at you, shaking in front of us." The sting burned deep. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. He closed it again. The silence was worse than any insult. Crowe seized the moment, his voice smooth as velvet laced with poison. "Gentlemen, ladies, perhaps what Sterling lacks in leadership, Crowe International can offer in abundance. I warned you all of his fragility. You chose him. And now, here you sit, victims of his failure." Laughter. Soft, cruel laughter rippled from the end of the table. Investors exchanged glances. Some nodded reluctantly. Richard's chest tightened. His legacy, his empire, his pride, slipping like sand through his fingers. He glanced toward the window. The city stretched below, vast and merciless. It had crowned him once. Tonight, it prepared to watch him fall. Evelyn shifted slightly. Her movement was quiet, almost invisible. But in her heart, words began to form. She had no right to speak, no seat at the table, and yet the truth clawed at her throat. She had watched Richard Sterling long enough to know the man was not a fraud. He was proud, yes, stubborn, often. But hollow? No. The deal was flawed, but not beyond saving. She could see what they couldn't. Richard attempted once more. Give me time. Just time to restructure, to— No, Victoria snapped. Time is money, Sterling, and you've wasted both. Crow's smirk widened. It's over. Accept it. The words echoed like a hammer, striking the final nail. Richard lowered his head, the weight of humiliation pressing against him. His hands clenched against the wood, but the strength had left him. And then— Evelyn coughed. It was small, unremarkable, but in that silence it cut through like glass. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. The billionaire, the investors, even Crow, all looked toward the corner where she stood. Evelyn froze, the mop handle still in her grasp. Her uniform suddenly felt heavier, her presence more intrusive. But there was no turning back. "Excuse me," she said softly. Her voice was gentle but carried a quiet firmness. "May I say something?" The room erupted. Some laughed outright. Others frowned in disbelief. A maid? Speaking here? Impossible. Crow sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is no place for the help. Go back to your corner, woman." But Evelyn did not move. She straightened, her eyes locking on Richard's. In that gaze, he saw something he hadn't felt in hours. Hope. "I believe I can fix this," she said simply. Gasps broke across the room. Investors leaned forward, incredulous. Richard blinked, stunned, and for the first time that evening, the mighty Alexander Crow's smirk faltered. The boardroom had been filled with power and pride, but now it was filled with silence. A silence, owned not by the billionaire nor by his rival, but by his maid. The silence after Evelyn's words was heavier than any insult Crow had delivered. Every head turned toward her, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. For a moment, the boardroom seemed unreal, suspended in a strange, timeless pause, where the clatter of power had been replaced by the voice of someone invisible. Richard Sterling stared at her in disbelief. His maid, the woman who polished the brass handles of his office doors and quietly refilled the water pitchers. He knew her name, Evelyn, but he had never looked past the surface of her role. And now she stood taller than anyone in the room, her voice trembling but certain. "I said," she repeated slowly, "I believe I can fix this." Crow laughed first, a sharp, mocking sound that sliced the air. "Fix this?" He leaned forward, his cold eyes locking on her. "You, a maid? Do you have the faintest idea of what you're even looking at? These are million-dollar deals, financial equations, global stakes. Go back to your mop, girl. This is no stage for you." Some investors chuckled, others whispered behind hands. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She placed the mop gently against the wall and stepped forward. Her steps were small, respectful, but unshaken. Her gaze swept across the investors, then rested on the screen flashing with red numbers. "With all due respect," she said, "I've been cleaning these halls for 3 years. I've picked up the papers you left behind, listened to the calls you thought no one was hearing, and watched patterns you assumed were invisible. And I've seen one truth clear as day. This deal isn't failing because of bad numbers. It's failing because of blind pride." The murmurs turned sharp. The investors stiffened. Crow's smirk twitched into anger. Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength. "You've all looked at the same graphs, the same projections. You've all seen the red lines and panicked, but no one's asked why the numbers fell. No one's asked where the real weight lies. You're staring at the symptom, not the cause. And that is why you're ready to abandon a man who has built half this city's skyline." Her words were like strikes of lightning in a storm. Investors glanced at each other uneasily. Richard himself sat frozen, caught between shame and awe. Victoria. Hayes scoffed, folding her manicured hands. And what would you know of causes and numbers, girl? You clean floors. Evelyn looked at her without fear. Floors tell stories, too. You'd be surprised how much dirt they hold. The room gasped, a quiet, collective intake of breath. For the first time, someone had dared to answer Victoria back. Richard's eyes softened. He saw something familiar in Evelyn's defiance. The fire he once carried, the fire he thought he had lost. Crow slammed his hand on the table. Enough of this nonsense. Sterling, control your staff before she embarrasses you further. But Evelyn turned toward him, her gaze steady. Embarrassment isn't what ruins men like you, Mr. Crow. It's arrogance. And arrogance is what blinds you to the fact that Sterling's deal isn't broken. It's misunderstood. Crow's jaw clenched. The investors leaned in. Curiosity sparked in their eyes. Explain, the older man with piercing blue eyes demanded, the same investor who had slammed his palm earlier. His tone was skeptical, but his interest was undeniable. Evelyn nodded respectfully. She walked closer to the screen, her shadow cast tall against the red lines. You're panicking because the projections dropped, but those numbers, they're short-term. They reflect immediate costs, not long-term gains. I've seen the contracts. I've seen the margins on transport and the overlooked clause about resource allocation. Everyone here dismissed it as minor. But if you read carefully, that clause alone ensures recovery within a year, faster than Crow's offer could ever provide. Investors stiffened. Some immediately reached for their papers. Others glanced toward Crow, whose face was tightening. Evelyn raised her chin. You're so blinded by the dip in profits that you're ready to hand your empire to a man who's been waiting for you to stumble. But this deal, Sterling's deal, is not failure. It's a test, one that pays not in months, but in decades. The words fell heavy. Silence returned, but this time it was different. Not mocking, not cruel. This silence carried weight. The weight of doubt, the weight of possibility. Victoria frowned, flipping through her papers. She's not wrong. The clause does say, Crow shot her a look so sharp it silenced her mid-sentence. But the damage was done. Doubt had been planted. Richard blinked, his chest rising with something he hadn't felt in hours. Breath. He leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Evelyn, what else do you see? Evelyn hesitated. The room's eyes pressed against her, heavy as stone. She was a maid. She had no right, and yet she had already stepped into the fire. There was no turning back. She took a slow breath. I see a room full of brilliant minds who've forgotten the simplest truth. Success is not measured in days. It is measured in resilience. Mr. Sterling has built that resilience into this deal, even if he failed to present it clearly. You don't need a new leader. You need clearer eyes. Her words hit like thunder. Investors looked at one another, some nodding slowly. Others frowned in thought. Crow slammed the table again. This is ridiculous. Are you really entertaining the delusions of a janitor? This is an insult to every serious investor here. But the older investor with blue eyes leaned back, his hand pressed against his chin. His voice was calm, thoughtful. And yet, she makes more sense than you have all evening, Crow. The boardroom shifted. Power shifted. Crow's smirk dissolved. Richard's heart pounded. He looked at Evelyn, this woman he had passed in hallways 1,000 times, never realizing the fire she carried. In her voice, he heard clarity. In her defiance, he found courage. And in that moment, for the first time that night, Richard Sterling straightened his shoulders. The billionaire had fallen, but the maid had silenced the room. And she wasn't done yet. The room no longer belonged to Crow. The air no longer bent to his arrogance. It bent toward Evelyn, the maid who had dared to speak. Richard sat taller now, his eyes clearer than before. But he still said nothing. This wasn't his moment. He knew it. Somehow, the torch had passed to Evelyn, and though it terrified him, he allowed it. An investor in a gray suit cleared his throat. If what you're saying is true, then prove it. Show us how this so-called overlooked clause makes the difference. Crow sneered. What a waste of time. You're really going to let her? But the older man with blue eyes raised a hand, silencing him. Let her speak. All eyes turned back to Evelyn. Her heart pounded so loud she swore they could hear it. But her face stayed calm. She walked slowly to the table, where the contracts and graphs lay scattered. Papers filled with jargon, numbers that terrified even seasoned investors. She placed a hand on one sheet, smoothing its crumpled edge. Here, she said softly. Clause 32. The investors leaned in. Evelyn pointed at the line, her finger steady. This clause ensures that once construction hits Phase 3, material sourcing shifts from overseas vendors to domestic partners. It saves shipping costs, stabilizes supply chains, and shortens delivery times. None of you noticed because it's hidden beneath all the legal language. But I've seen this sheet 100 times, picking it up off this very floor after late-night meetings. I memorized it without even meaning to. The room buzzed. Some scribbled notes. Others flipped their copies to confirm. Victoria frowned. If she's right, that alone would reduce overhead by 15%, another investor muttered. And that means... It means, Evelyn finished, her voice firm, that the deal is not bleeding. It's breathing. It looks weak now because the savings haven't activated yet. You're panicking over a seedling because it hasn't grown into a tree. But in a year's time, this tree will be stronger than anything Crow could offer you. Gasps filled the room. Crow's jaw tightened, his knuckles white on the table. He was losing them. The older man with blue eyes leaned forward. Interesting. Very interesting. His gaze pierced Evelyn. But tell me, girl, are you suggesting that we simply wait and hope? That we put millions on hold for the promise of some future benefit? Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile. No, I'm suggesting that you look deeper. The contract isn't just saving money in a year. It's already protecting you now. Clause 32 is the future, yes. But Clause 21, that's your present. The investors quickly searched. Pages rustled like leaves in a storm. Clause 21, one muttered. Yes, Evelyn said, her voice steady. The risk-sharing clause. It limits liability. During the early stages, you've been panicking about losses, but you're not even liable for most of them. You've been sitting here ready to abandon Sterling when the contract is already protecting you. You just couldn't see it because you were blinded by red lines on a graph. A heavy silence settled. Then one investor swore under his breath. Another laughed nervously. She's right, Victoria whispered reluctantly. We're panicking over nothing. Richard blinked, his breath caught in his chest. He had overlooked it too. The maid, the woman who had dusted his shelves and polished his glass windows, had seen what he, a billionaire, had missed. Crow slammed his fist on the table. This is absurd! You're letting a maid lecture you about multi-million-dollar contracts? Have you all lost your minds? But the investors weren't listening to him anymore. Their eyes followed Evelyn as she spoke, their pens scribbled down her words. She lifted her gaze, meeting their eyes one by one. I may not be an investor, I may not wear expensive suits or sit in corner offices, but I know what I've seen. I've seen Mr. Sterling stay late into the night working on this. I've seen him refuse to cut corners even when it would have been easier. I've seen the sweat of someone who believes in something bigger than himself. And I've seen Crow here, circling like a vulture, waiting for weakness so he can feed. You have a choice tonight. You can follow fear, or you can follow truth. The words struck deep. One by one, investors sat back in their chairs, their doubt turning into quiet consideration. Richard felt his throat tighten. He wanted to speak, to thank her, to stand beside her, But the room was hers, not his. For the first time in years, he realized leadership wasn't always about speaking. Sometimes it was about listening, but Crow wasn't finished. His eyes burned with fury, his smile returning like a blade unsheathed. "Fine," he hissed. "You've all been entertained by this performance. But let's see how she handles the real numbers. Let's see if the maid can survive when we put her under the fire." He snapped his fingers. His assistant hurried forward with a thick file and dropped it onto the table with a heavy thud. "Projections," Crow said coldly. "Real projections. Not the scrap she's overheard while scrubbing floors. Let's see if she can explain these without drowning." The file was pushed toward Evelyn. She looked at it, her hands still. Her heart raced. These were complex sheets, deeper than anything she had seen. Richard leaned forward, ready to intervene, but Evelyn lifted her chin. "I'll try," she said simply. Crow smirked. "Then try, and watch yourself fail. Say." Investors leaned in, the room charged with anticipation. Evelyn opened the file slowly, her eyes scanning the endless lines of numbers. Her breath slowed. She let the chaos settle, her mind reaching back to every scrap of knowledge she had absorbed, every overheard conversation, every forgotten paper she had picked up. And then she saw it. Her lips curved faintly. "Mr. Crow," she said softly, her voice slicing through the silence. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the pattern you buried here?" Crow's smirk faltered. The investors stiffened. Richard's eyes widened. Evelyn turned a page, her finger tapping the numbers. "This isn't projection. This is manipulation." The room exploded. The file in Evelyn's hands felt heavier than stone. Each page bristled with rows of numbers, charts, and forecasts, the kind that made even sharp investors sweat. But she didn't flinch. Her eyes moved like lightning, absorbing, calculating, connecting dots no one else had dared to connect. Crow leaned back, smirking. "Well, do you understand even half of it? Or do you need me to fetch a dictionary?" But Evelyn didn't answer him. She turned another page, her brow furrowing, her lips curling with a sharpness that made the room lean in. Finally, she spoke. "This file is designed to scare you." The words landed like a thunderclap. "What?" an investor blurted. Evelyn's finger traced a column of red numbers. "See here? Loss projections? Inflated." The same negative figure repeated 3 times across different charts, disguised as separate losses, but they're all the same cost counted over and over. It makes the deal look weaker than it is. And here, future risks are exaggerated by doubling estimated costs of supply chain delays. But those delays? They're already covered under Clause 21. Crow presented this as a collapse waiting to happen, but it's smoke and mirrors. Gasps spread around the table. Papers shuffled as investors compared notes. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "You're saying these projections are falsified?" Evelyn nodded, calm, steady. "Not falsified, twisted, bent to tell a story of failure when the truth is far more balanced. Someone wanted you to panic. Someone wanted you to run." All eyes swiveled toward Crow. His smirk faltered, then sharpened. "How dare you? These are industry-standard models." "No," Evelyn said firmly. "They're traps, and you set them." The room froze. Richard's chest burned with a pride he hadn't felt in years. His maid, had not only steadied the storm but was turning it back on the predator. One investor slammed his palm on the table. "She's right. Look at page 42. Duplicated losses again. How did we miss this?" Another shook his head, muttering, "Crow must have doctored these projections himself." Crow's face reddened, his voice rising. "This is outrageous. She's just a maid. And yet, she's the only one here who saw the truth." The man, with blue eyes, interrupted sharply. His voice cut through the room like steel. "What does that say about the rest of us?" Silence. Thick. Unforgiving. Crow's mask cracked. His jaw clenched, his fists balled. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She flipped to the final page, holding it high for all to see. And here, the nail in the coffin. Crow's firm projected. The deal would collapse by Q3. But notice this footnote. She pointed. Source, Crow and Associates Internal Review. Not an independent auditor, not a third-party analysis. He fed you his own doctored fears to drive you away, so he could swoop in and buy the project at a fraction of its value. The explosion was immediate. Shouts erupted, investors demanding answers, papers slamming onto the table. Crow stammered, his smooth words drowned beneath the weight of fury. You tried to deceive us? Were you planning to gut Sterling's deal for yourself? This is fraud. Crow's face twisted. You fools! Do you really believe her over me? She cleans floors, she polishes glass, she doesn't belong here. But the words no longer landed. They sounded desperate, weak, shrill. The more he spoke, the smaller he seemed. Evelyn closed the file softly, her eyes unwavering. Truth doesn't care who speaks it, whether it comes from a billionaire or a maid. The room fell into stunned silence. Richard finally rose from his chair. For the first time that night, his voice carried strength. You've all heard it. Evelyn has laid bare what I was too blind to see. Crow tried to break this deal with lies, but the truth has found its way to light, and it came from the one person no one here thought would matter. He turned, looking at Evelyn. She matters, more than I ever realized. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him to say that aloud. Not here, not now. The investors murmured among themselves. Their gazes shifted from Crow to Richard to Evelyn. Slowly, heads began to nod. Agreement, respect. The man with blue eyes finally leaned, back folding his arms. Well, he said quietly, it seems the balance has shifted. He looked at Richard. You still have my support, and, judging by this room, you'll have much more than that. Richard exhaled, the weight lifting from his chest. But Crow wasn't finished. He shot up from his chair, slamming both palms onto the table. This isn't over, he hissed, his face flushed with rage. You think this girl saved you? She just signed your death warrant. You'll regret this, Sterling. And as for you, his glare cut like knives toward Evelyn. You'll wish you never opened your mouth. The threat hung heavy in the air. Some investors shifted uncomfortably, but Evelyn didn't flinch. She stood tall, her voice calm, cutting through the venom. I've been invisible my whole life. I'm not afraid of being seen now. The room erupted with applause, not polite applause, fierce, thunderous, defiant applause that drowned out Crow's rage. Richard felt his throat tighten as he looked at her. She had done it. She had silenced the room, not with wealth, not with power, but with truth. Crow's face twisted into a mask of hatred. He grabbed his file, his assistant scrambling to follow. This isn't the end, he spat before. Storming out, the doors slamming behind him. For a long moment, the room was still. The investors looked at Evelyn with awe, respect, and something deeper, gratitude. And Richard. Richard felt something break open inside him, a crack in the armor he had built around his heart. Because in the silence that followed, he realized he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Not a deal, not a victory, but a revelation. The maid had silenced the world. The boardroom still hummed with echoes of thunderous applause. Crow was gone, but his shadow lingered like smoke. Richard sat down slowly, his chest rising and falling, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. She stood quietly now, her hands folded in front of her, as if she hadn't just shifted the course of millions of dollars with a few words of truth. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the man with blue eyes cleared his throat. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "this deal is yours. Our confidence has been restored. Not because of your wealth, not because of your reputation, but because of her." All eyes turned to Evelyn again, the maid. The woman in a plain uniform who had stood taller than billionaires. Richard swallowed hard. "You're right," he said quietly. "If I've learned anything tonight, it's that brilliance doesn't wear a suit, and truth doesn't need a fortune." He looked at Evelyn, his voice firm. "From this day forward, you're not just my maid. You're my partner." The room gasped. Evelyn's eyes widened. "Partner?" she whispered. Richard nodded. "Partner. In business. If you'll accept. You've proven yourself wiser than men twice my age and richer than kings. And if you'll allow me, I'd like you by my side." Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to protest, to insist she wasn't worthy. But deep inside, a small, quiet voice reminded her. She had been worthy all along. The world had simply refused to see it until now. An older investor leaned forward. His expression softened. "Miss Evelyn, if you decide to step into this world, you'll find more allies here than you think. I, for one, would trust my investments in your hands." The others murmured in agreement. The very people who had dismissed her hours ago now looked at her with reverence, respect. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. Standing straighter, she nodded. "If I can help build something honest, something true, then yes, I'll stand by your side, Mr. Sterling." Richard smiled. A real smile, not the forced one he'd worn for years. For the first time, he felt lighter. He had been saved not by numbers or lawyers, but by the courage of the one person he had overlooked for too long. The meeting closed with signatures and handshakes, but the real victory had already been won. As the investors filed out, some stopped to shake Evelyn's hand, their eyes filled with admiration. When the last of them had gone, the room grew quiet again. Only Richard and Evelyn remained. He turned to her, his voice low. "You know, when Crow said you didn't belong here, a part of me almost believed it. Not because it was true, but because I've spent my life thinking only money makes someone valuable. Tonight, you taught me otherwise." Evelyn's gaze softened. "And you taught me something too," she replied gently. "That even the powerful can lose their way. But it's never too late to listen, to change." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. "I owe you more than I can ever repay." "You don't owe me," Evelyn said softly. "Just promise me you'll never forget what you saw tonight. That sometimes the smallest voices hold the greatest truths." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I promise." For a long moment, they stood in silence. Two souls from different worlds, bound now by something greater than contracts or wealth, by truth, courage, and respect. As they left the building together, the night air felt different, lighter, electric. Evelyn looked up at the towering skyscrapers, no longer daunting but full of possibility. And Richard, for the first time in years, felt hope flicker in his chest. Word of what had happened spread quickly. Investors whispered about the maid who silenced the room. Headlines spun tales of a billionaire saved by someone no one saw coming. And behind every story, behind every retelling, Evelyn's quiet strength shone brighter than any fortune. Because in the end, she hadn't just fixed a deal. She had changed lives. She had changed him. And though the world would remember Richard Sterling as a billionaire, those who were there that night would always remember the truth. That when the billionaire failed in front of everyone, his maid silenced the room,